Hi, you guys. This is our first Triple Play Thursday. I'm going to read the first 3 pages from 3 different genres of books from 3 different age levels. We've got our fiction fragments for adults. We've got our teen tidbits for our young adult novels. And then for our juvenile fiction, we have Middle School Morsels. If you guys are like me, I tend to avoid certain genres. I label them as ones I don't like. And they're not all the same. All books in a specific genre are not all the same. And I don't really give some authors a chance. If I don't like the cover of a book, I totally judge books by their covers. And if I don't like a cover of it, I'm not going to read it. So I have 3 different books here for the adults, and we're going to get started. I'm going to put on my glasses so I can actually read the words. And the first one I'm going to read is David Weaver and Chris Kennedy, Into the Light. This is a science fiction novel. I wouldn't normally pick it up, but today I'm going to read the first 3 pages. Year 1 of the Terran Empire. Chapter 1, Aurora, Minnesota, United States. The soft, wet sound of an ending world burned in Louis Freymark's ears as he crouched to drop more wood into the fire. Spits of sleet hissed as they filtered into the flames, and the tarp he'd rigged to break the worst of the wind flapped in the drenched, blowing darkness. It was almost enough, almost, to drown out the sound of his daughter's cough. He hunched his shoulders, bending over, using the end of a limb to rearrange the burning branches. They didn't really need it, but it gave him a few more minutes before he had to look up, face Janet and the kids, and he couldn't do that, not just yet. His heart cried out to take them all in his arms, shelter them against the cold, promise them that he was there and that somehow they'd get through this as they'd gotten through everything else. But he couldn't do that either. He couldn't, because this time he couldn't be their strength. Because this time his own despair would only have broken whatever scraps of hope might still sustain them. There'd been no weather reports in months, not since the Shangari had brought nightmare and destruction to Earth. But there was snow somewhere beyond the sleet. Freymark could smell it. He could feel it in the icy little teeth biting at the back of his neck as he crouched, using his body to give Janice and Stevie and Francesca and Jackie, oh, especially Jackie, any fragment of windbreak he could. And in his heart, he knew it didn't matter. He'd grown up in Duluth, 50-odd miles from this unquiet, hopeless refugee camp. He knew northern winters. He knew how cruel they could be, even without murderous aliens from beyond the stars. And because he did, he knew exactly what would happen. For a while, he'd thought they could make it. The farmhouse outside of town, the town of Babbitt, had belonged to his cousin, but Jake and Suzanne had been in St. Paul when the initial Shangari kinetic strike turned the entire Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area into fire, ash, smoke, and death. Freymark and Janice were supposed to have joined them for the river cruise until Francesca's impacted wisdom teeth required immediate surgery instead. They'd just gotten home from the oral surgeons when the initial strikes went in. Minneapolis-St. Paul hadn't died alone. Washington, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Denver, Spokane, London, Paris, Berlin, Moscow, Ottawa. The dirge of murdered cities had rolled like the fanfare of apocalypse. And the unending list had only grown and grown in the months since. There had been fresh reports almost daily, at least until the internet, the communication satellites, even the emergency band radios had gone down. Duluth had been destroyed 2 months after Minneapolis-St. Paul in one of the Shangari's reprisal strikes. Freymark didn't have a clue what the reprisal had been for, but it didn't matter, not really, not beside the death toll which had swept across his country and his world like some black, bottomless tide. Yet he and Janice and the kids had been safe. They'd loaded up the SUV, headed north for sleepy little Babbitt, where there was nothing for the invaders to waste their kinetic bombardments upon. When they'd known Jake and Suzanne's farmhouse would stand empty, indeed, his greatest fear had been that they'd find someone else already squatting on the family farm, but civilization hadn't gone into the crapper that quickly, not then. Jacqueline coughed wetly behind him again, and he clenched his jaw tighter, feeling the cold closing in, staring into the flames as they crackled against the hateful dark. Jake and Suzanne's family garden, had helped a lot over the summer, and he and Janice had preserved what they could. Neither of them had known a thing about canning, but they dragged out Suzanne's canning supplies, chased down instructions on the internet, and printed them out while they still had electricity and before the puppies took out the net. And they'd managed to put up a lot of food. Or it had seemed like a lot, just looking at it in the pantry, until he thought about feeding a family of 7 through a Minnesota winter. Yet they could have made it. He knew they could have. Babbitt was still a functional town. Its mayor and city council had managed somehow to hold their community together, and if they hadn't been delighted to see strangers, neither had they tried to turn them away. Besides, he hadn't been a stranger, not really. And Douglas and Carla Jackson had spoken for them. Carla had been Suzanne's sister, and Fraymark had known her since he was 9, visiting his aunt and uncle in Babbitt, and helped the Fraymarks settle in at the farm. And there were still deer to eke out of their food supply, and there were always fish in Birch Lake. And so he'd been able to tell himself that whatever happened to the rest of the world, his family would make it. Until 3 weeks ago, anyway. There were a lot of things Louis Fraymark would never know, and one of them was why the puppies had decided to strike Babbitt. The town had never had more than 1,400 or 1,500 citizens, although it probably crept higher than that over the summer and early autumn as other refugees filtered in. How could it have posed any kind of threat to star-traveling aliens was more than he could imagine. Maybe it had been a reprisal for something someone had done, or maybe it had been no more than pure viciousness on the Shangari's part. He didn't know, and it didn't matter anyway. What did matter was that Babbitt had disappeared into the same horrific fireball which had claimed a 17-year-old boy, a boy turning into a man any parent could have been proud of, named Dennis Fraymark. Dennis had taken the SUV to town to trade some of their precious canned food for medicine. The Babbitt Medical Center had continued to serve the town and its froth of refugees, but Mayor Oswald and the City Council had collected the stock of Babbitt's half-dozen pharmacies under lock and key and armed guard. They probably would have let Dennis have at least some of what he needed anyway, but it never hurt to contribute to the little something to the town's food stocks in exchange. Only there'd never been an exchange. And the blast, front, and fire had swept outward from the devastated town, burning through the tinder dry leaves of autumn with no one left to fight it. He'd had just enough warning to get Janice and the kids, grab Jake's sporterized Lee Enfield deer rifle, a couple of boxes of ammunition, and all the food they could carry, and get as far as the lake before the flames swept through, devouring everything in their path. He'd sheltered in the lake water, icy cold even in the height of summer, much less in fall, neck deep, holding Jackal in his arms and feeling her shiver as the fire roared and bellowed around them. And when the flames were done, the farm was gone. So they'd come here, almost 20 miles west of Babbitt, to what had been the almost equally small town of Aurora. All of Babbitt's handful of survivors had ended up here in the refugee camp that sprawled across the high school's athletic field on the west side of town near the lake. There was another on the football and baseball fields between Forestry Road and 3rd Avenue on the other side of town, but there were precious few amenities for either. The high school had long since filled every classroom with refugees. There was no space inside it for late arrivals, however desperate their need, and so they crouched in whatever shelter they could while the exhausted city government tried hopelessly to find better asylum for them. He could smell the overstrained portable toilets and the communal latrine pits from here. Water had to be hauled in from the lake using some of the town's old water trucks, drawn by the priceless handful of horses who'd survived and been pressed into service as supplies of gasoline and diesel vanished. Food was already scarce and getting scarcer every day, despite mandatory rationing that restricted adults to no more than 1,400 calories a day, and medical supplies were non-existent. There you go, the first 3 pages of Into the Light by David Weber and Chris Kennedy, and this is a sci-fi novel. Next, we're going to read 3 pages of Denise Hunter's Bookshop by the Sea. This is a Christian romance. Chapter 1. 11 months had not been long enough to prepare Sophie Lawson for the sight of him. Presently, Aidan Maddox sauntered into the dockhouse like he owned the place, the din in the restaurant rising at his arrival. One at a time, the groomsmen grasped his hand and pulled him in for a shoulder bump. 7 minutes late. Aidan swept Sophie's sister into a hug, giving her a peck on the cheek. His masculine frame dwarfed Jenna's slight build. The bride-to-be accepted his affection with apparent warmth that tweaked a thread of betrayal in Sophie's frayed heart. Since she hadn't seen him in 7 years, and since he was otherwise occupied, she allowed herself a quick assessment. He dressed up a pair of jeans with a blue sports coat that she knew, even from across the room, matched his eyes perfectly. At the moment, he was talking to Grant, his best friend and Jenna's fiancé, smiling that same crooked smile that used to set her pulse thrumming. Aiden tossed his head back, laughing with abandon. He looked much the same, just a little less boy and a little more man. His shoulders were broader, and he sported a 5 o'clock shadow. He still had those sensual lips, the top one curving like a heart, dipping low in the middle. But she didn't have to stalk him on social media to know what he looked like now, when they knew so many of the same. His eyes locked on hers. Sophie's fingers tightened on the chair she stood behind. Her quick peek had turned into a prolonged stare. She jerked her gaze away, pushed in the chair, and sought escape. Open French doors led onto the deck where the party would soon dine. The May breeze skittered over her skin as she slipped outside. Twilight's rosy hue lit the landscape, the marina with all its boats, and the shimmering harbor. Water rippled against the pilings, and somewhere nearby, hardware pinged on a sailboat mast. Sophie straightened the name card she'd placed earlier on the long rectangular table. She had put herself to the right of the bride, Grant to the left, and Aiden just beyond him, a safe 3 chairs from her own. Her father would be on Sophie's other side, but that couldn't be helped. She had to keep him away from her twin brother Seth and their maternal grandmother. Sophie glanced at her watch. Their dad was now 10 minutes late. She sent him a text. It was her job to run interference tonight, which included overseeing her dad's movements and keeping Grant's grandfather from the booze. She ignored the erratic thumping of her heart, which had little to do with her assignments, and instead focused on positive things. The flickering votives, the white twinkle lights, the jazz music flowing through the speakers, and the savory scents of grilled steak and fresh garlic. In the 11 months since they'd been engaged, Jenna and Grant had gone back and forth a dozen times on the menu, requiring Sophie to call the restaurant as many times. But all that was behind them now. The stage was perfectly set for a beautiful rehearsal dinner. As she reached for a votive, the hair on her arms lifted. The oxygen was suddenly too thick to breathe. She didn't have to turn around. Aiden had followed her outside. "Hello, Sophie." The sound of her name on his lips made something twist hard and tight inside. Anger, that's what it was. She stared into eyes that gazed at her with fondness. Fondness! As though he had any right to look at her that way. At least he wasn't presuming to hug her as he had the others. Surely he knew she wouldn't welcome an embrace. Christian fiction, Denise Hunter's Bookshop by the Sea. Okay, the third one I'm going to read is by the author of The Silent Patient. This is called The Maidens by Alex Michaelides. Tell me tales of thy first love, April hopes, the fools of chance, till the graves begin to move and the dead begin to dance. Alfred Lord Tennyson, Division of Sin. The Maidens. Prologue. Edward Fosca was a murderer. This was a fact. This wasn't something Mariana knew just on an intellectual level. As an idea, her body knew it. She felt it in her bones, along her blood, and deep within every cell. Edward Fosca was guilty. And yet, she couldn't prove it, and might never prove it. This man, this monster who had killed at least 2 people, might, in all likelihood, walk free. He was so smug, so sure of himself. He thinks he's gotten away with it, she thought. He thought he had won, but he hadn't, not yet. Mariana was determined to outsmart him. She had to. She would sit up all night and remember everything that had happened. She would sit here in this small, dark room in Cambridge and think and work it out. She stared at the red bar of the electric heater on the wall, burning, glowing in the dark, willing herself into a kind of trance. In her mind, she would go back to the very beginning and remember it all, every single detail, and she would catch him. Part 1. No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. C.S. Lewis, A Grief Observed. Chapter 1. A few days earlier, Mariana was at home in London. She was on her knees on the floor, surrounded by boxes. She was making yet another half-hearted attempt to sort through Sebastian's belongings. It wasn't going well. A year on from his death, the majority of his things remained spread around the house in various piles and half-empty boxes. She seemed unable to complete the task. Mariana was still in love with him. That was the problem. Even though she knew she'd never see Sebastian again, even though he was gone for good, she was still in love and didn't know how to deal with all of this love of hers. There was so much of it, and it was so messy, leaking, spilling, tumbling out of her like stuffing falling out of an old rag doll that was coming apart at the seams. If only she could box up her love as she was attempting to do with his possessions. What a pitiful sight it was, a man's life reduced to a collection of unwanted items for a jumble sale. Mariana reached into the nearest box. She pulled out a pair of shoes. She considered them, the old green trainers he had for running on the beach. They still had a slightly sodden feel about them, with grains of sand embedded in the soles. Get rid of them, she said to herself. Throw them in the bin. Do it. Even as she thought this, she knew it was an impossibility. They weren't him. They weren't Sebastian. They weren't the man she loved and would love forever. They were just a pair of old shoes. Even so, parting with them would be an act of self-harm, like pressing a knife to her arm and slicing off a sliver of skin. Instead, Mariana brought the shoes close to her chest. She cradled them tight as she might a child, and she wept. How had she ended up like this? In the space of just a year, which once would have slipped by almost imperceptibly, and now stretched out behind her like a desolate landscape flattened by a hurricane. The life she had known had been obliterated, leaving Mariana here, 36 years old, alone and drunk on a Sunday night, clutching a dead man's shoes as if they were holy relics, which, in a way, they were. Something beautiful, something holy had died. All that remained were the books he read, the clothes he wore, the things he touched. She could still smell him on them, still taste him on the tip of her tongue. That's why she couldn't throw away his possessions. By holding on to them, she could keep Sebastian alive somehow, just a little bit. If she let go, she'd lose him entirely. Recently, out of morbid curiosity and in an attempt to understand what she was wrestling with, Mariana had reread all of Freud's writings about grief and loss. And he argued that following the death of a loved one, the loss had to be psychologically accepted and the person relinquished, or else you ran the risk of succumbing to pathological mourning, which he called melancholia, and we call depression. Mariana understood this. She knew she should relinquish Sebastian, but she couldn't, because she was still in love with him. She was in love even though he was gone forever, gone behind the veil. Behind the veil. Behind the veil. Where was that from? Tennyson, probably. Behind the veil. That's how it felt. Since Sebastian died, Mariana no longer saw the world in color. Life was muted and gray and far away behind a veil, behind a mist of sadness. She wanted to hide from the world and all its noise and pain and cocoon herself in her work in her little yellow house. And that's where she would have stayed if Zoe hadn't phoned her from Cambridge that night in October. Zoe's phone call after the Monday evening group, that was how it started. That was how the nightmare began. The Maidens by Alex Michaelides, and this is a psychological thriller. And that's it for our fiction fragments. Hope you guys found something you might be interested in. Bye.